Prime Time. Prime Time Podcast.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome on back to the Prime Time Podcast. So, the last couple of weeks we've talked about, was the sheriff misleading the public when it came to the crime data for the county and when it came to overspending when it regards the budget. And so we went over that ad nauseum, and I think we made it very clear there's no crime report that's been given for the county. There's never been one that we've seen publicly. And of course, we've showed you some frivolous spending. And on last week's program, we talked a lot about the Mobile County Sheriff's Department enforcement side and what I felt like was an absorbent amount of overtime that has been spent in 2025, as much as, deputies making up to over $180,000. And I think that's problematic. And so today we'll look a little bit. I didn't go through like I did last time and put more than, however many we have here. I think we have maybe 7 or 8 names here, but these are the ones that stuck out. These were the ones that were the most highest paid at the Sheriff's Department as it relates to correction officers at the jail. So let's just get right into the program. So as you can see, we'll start talking about it a little bit. And so we have and again, we're not going to list names. Now this particular information data, much like last week, let me give you the website. Looks like it comes from govsalaries.com. And so they put out the annual salaries of public employees, assuming that it's because the public employees, typically don't have the same privileges or the right to privacy when it comes to public records as private employees do. But nonetheless, we'll get right into it. I'm not going to list the correction officers' names on here because, again, much like I said in the program last week, this is not about the correction officers or the deputies. And while that is what the incumbent is trying to make it with some of his supporters being vocal who are deputies, this is not about them. And we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the program. This is about the failure at the very top of the organization to manage the overtime budget and the lack of oversight. And I understand those that are benefiting are not going to like the program and they're going to be very vocal and et cetera, et cetera. I get it. I completely get it. But the employees don't get to dictate how the elected official is responsible to the people that elect them to be in office. So we're not really concerned with that. Okay. What we're concerned with, again, is the people's money. So we're not going to give you the names. We're going to give you the initials. The first one is a correction officer. JP, I think, would be the initials. And you can see in 2025, that individual made $154,000. Now, again, if you'll remember, last year that individual made $145,000. And then, of course, in 23, when all the information about Deputy Holyfield became public, you can see in 22 the amount of money that Deputy Holyfield made, which was $237,000. And incidentally, in 22, this particular correction officer made $115,000, which was roughly about $100,000 more than that individual made in 2021, which is probably more in line with that individual's salary if I had to guess, barring any promotions over the next 4 years to 2025. But again, you can see the pattern. When the incident with Holyfield became public in 23, it looks like all of these correction officers' pay, again, much like those on the enforcement side, went down and the amount of overtime that was being used. And again, I liken that to the sheriff's department, the sheriff, having to get a handle on things. It was a cluster. It was a mess when Holyfield's thing came out. And of course, we see the same thing from the enforcement side here on the Metro Jail side, where the amount of overtime being used in 2023, you can see it for yourself, had completely went down. But in then 24 and 25, those numbers went up again. The next one is a employee with the initials of DA. And in 25, that individual made $135,000, $134,000 in 24. And then in 2023, again, it dipped down probably closer to the average salary of that individual, if I had to guess, maybe a little bit more with a little overtime in there. But that was at 71. But the year before was $86,000. And then, of course, we'll go to the next one with initials KW. Now, that individual made $119,000, almost $120,000. The year before, $108,000. But again, you can see in 2023, it dips down to $73,000. And then the year before that was $79,000. That's probably closer in line to, the average salary of that individual with a little bit of overtime. And certainly that's understandable. And of course, you can see the list goes on and on. So out of these are 8 individuals at the jail. They do not appear to me, based on the information and the sources I have, to be those at the entry level position, the correction officer position. These are sergeant and lieutenants. And this matters. And let me tell you why it matters. Much like on the enforcement side, typically, if you have entry level positions that have to be filled with any organization, the leader has to look at what, certainly the rank, the rate of pay, the overtime rate of pay, and what does that look like? And if you're just trying to cover a shift, a patrol shift, or a shift within the jail, it seems to me that if that's where the shortage is, and we'll play, matter of fact, let's go ahead and play it. I think this is probably the best time to do it. We'll play audio.
But so, overtime, we're monitor it closely on the enforcement side. It fluctuates up and down. If you have a standoff or a barricaded subject, you deploy a SWAT team, that you can spend $10,000, in just a few hours. But what we can't control is the overtime at the jail.
According to the sheriff's own words, is that he's somewhere 30, 40, maybe sometimes 50 correction officers short in the jail, and that he cannot control the overtime, that the commission cut his budget some $680,000. And if that was the case, he really overemphasized that he cannot control the overtime in the jail, and that was not his fault, because you have to have employees to work at the jail. So assuming that the starting pay of a correction officer is somewhere around $55,000 a year, well, we don't see that on here. What we see is sergeants and lieutenants, and I think that the pay would be a little bit more in line maybe with the deputy sergeant and lieutenant, and some of these amounts are absorbent. Now, does that mean they're not justified? No. Now, the jail has kind of a different operation. I'm sure some of these individuals have to travel out of town. They have to pick up inmates. They have to do overnight stays. So this may be a little bit more warranted than the enforcement side. But if we're strictly going off what the sheriff said, he cannot control the overtime. But now when we look at this amount of overtime with these 8 individuals, and these were the highest paid within the jail, and then you compare that to these over here with the enforcement side, it looks like all the overtime was spent on the enforcement side, and that not necessarily on the jail side, which the sheriff, made a valid point to say that's where, a lot of the overtime is being spent. It would appear to me that the sheriff simply doesn't know what he's doing when it comes to managing the overtime. And that's where he has really the most flexibility to manage his budget and to determine how much is too much, how much is not enough. And again, I don't say that to be disparaging. I just say that because these are absorbent amount of money that's being spent on overtime. Now, we said that to say this. Now we're going to move on just a little bit. I think we've talked enough about it, and I think we've put enough information out there that you can see there's just a lack of oversight and accountability coming from the top of the organization. Now, with that being said, let's talk just a little bit about overtime. I think it's important when we discuss overtime. So when we talk about overtime, here's what's important. Overtime should be authorized when minimum staffing levels cannot be met with regular schedules. There's a risk to public safety, service delivery, mission continuity, and certainly critical functions would otherwise stop or degrade. A lot of times there are gaps when it comes to public safety, right? And so overtime has to be used in conjunction and to be used to compensate deputies on their off time. For things such as signing warrants, attending court, maybe training would even be one, but it should not be used for deputies just to maintain a certain lifestyle. We know that some of these deputies have $250,000 boats, in my opinion. Some of these deputies, I think they went to social media and, made some allegations about taking care of maybe sick parents, and those reasons are valid. But what a lot of these people don't tell you is that these deputies are trying to maintain a lifestyle that they've built up around overtime. And that's kind of the number one rule in law enforcement, whether it's overtime or whether it's working extra jobs. Those things come as a privilege and as the exception to the rule. They're not the rule. And so this argument, I think, that's coming a lot from some of those that benefit the most at the sheriff's department, that, they have financial responsibilities. Sure, they do. Absolutely. We all have financial responsibilities. But as a subordinate of the sheriff, the leader, the elected position from the voters in the county, the subordinates don't get to determine what's proper in the amount of overtime being used or what's not proper. The people of the county elect that official to do what's right by them, both with the money, both when it comes to public safety and overall morale and discipline of the department. The subordinates do not get to determine and dictate that. So I understand that some of them are not happy with the podcast. I told you when I ran the program last week that a lot of them wasn't going to be happy. But if you look at the amount of them, it's a small few as a whole. I'd probably say less than a third, at least on the enforcement side, and probably less than that on the jail side. But on the enforcement side, don't be dismayed and concerned so much that a lot of those being the most vocal, that's a coordinated effort, right, to try to turn these deputies against me. But at the end of the day, the leader has to be above reproach. The leader has to do right by the people that elected them to office. And sometimes in government service, I talked about it early in this podcast on some of the early episodes of this blind loyalty and how sometimes some of the supervisors are laissez-faire and they allow the rank and file to do whatever they want to do until you have a situation like, one of these officers here recently was kind of forced to resign under an investigation because of some improprieties, that officer was involved in off duty. And the laissez-faire supervisor, in my opinion, does not do that deputy any service. In fact, I would argue that the deputy that lost his job essentially, while he may think that, the sheriff covered up his misdeeds or protected him, I think it's just really just the opposite. Had the sheriff done what he was supposed to do and intervened on this officer's life to try to get him some help if there's any type of drug addiction or alcohol addiction, I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying in a lot of these cases that's what you're dealing with. Even domestic issues, if we know these things are going on as leaders, we have a responsibility to intervene even when they don't like it, they don't see the need for intervention. It is our responsibility to try to do what we can, if we can, to salvage those deputies or officers' careers. And I heard it said one time years ago from a commander that was more senior than me, and he said, you'll find that you care more about these guys' career than they care about them themselves. At the end of the day, some of those deputies that are making the allegations, some of their comments, I think, are a little disheartening for me simply because, they live up to an oath of office, and their remarks and the things that they're saying, certainly, and I understand they're unhappy, but the things that they're saying really is a violation of their code of conduct. It's a violation of their oath, and it's conduct unbecoming. It brings disrepute to the organization, to the image of that organization. And of course, the sheriff is allowing it because, they're being vocal for him, and that's fine. I mean, that's kind of part of the process. But at the end of the day, there are, I would argue, probably 2/3 of the sheriff's department, and more than that, maybe 60% of the jail that is not making the kind of money with this overtime and being able to milk the system, if you will, to make this absorbent amount of money. Now, let's be very clear. I simply do not think that deputies should not be, or correction officers should not be in a position to make money. But overtime is the exception to the rule. It is not the rule. And my argument is, if we have $1 million, $1.5 million of this type of overtime that has been spent for 1 year, I would argue, could we have employed 20 or 30 more COs? Could we have employed a combination of maybe 10 or 15 more deputies and maybe 20 correction officers? There's a better way to manage the money based on what I'm seeing. I did give you one last week on the situation where the individual made over $183,000. It was probably more than $100,000 in overtime at the expense of the taxpayer. My argument, if you'll remember, was simply this: if that, and we don't know the rate of pay for that deputy. It was based on just an educated guess on what a deputy would make, and then a 10% rate of increase, for promotions, et cetera. But nevertheless, I think the principle still stands, is that individual, if the rate of pay was, I believe it was, I think I said 65, maybe 70,000, whatever it was, at that rate of pay, at the overtime rate, that individual would have had to earn 7 hours of overtime per day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. That doesn't give an account if the individual has 2 off days. It does not give an account if the individual took off sick or took vacation time, or even worked extra security jobs on his or her off day. Those are the things that are important, because then when you start saying, well, 7 hours a day, well, that don't seem like a lot, but 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and then we need to know, does the individual work an 8, 10, or 12-hour shift? It almost becomes impossible physically to work those kind of hours without maybe fudging some of the numbers. The overtime numbers are that are submitted, right? And so there should be, like the Mobile Police Department, we had 2 layers of supervision or supervisors that would approve overtime: the immediate supervisor and then the next supervisor in line. But I would also argue too that that overtime is not just submitted blindly with hopes that the boss signs off on it. Good leadership, good discipline, good morale, being a good steward of the people's money is knowing that if we're 2 deputies short on patrol and we need to backfill those positions, then there should be a pre-approval process to ensure that deputies are just not coming in saying, hey, I had to work yesterday, and nobody knew that they had to work, but it gets signed off on. what we do know is that it is a lot of money, and I think it deserves to be looked at. I understand some of the deputies aren't happy, and I get that. But at the end of the day, overtime is not for you to sustain a lifestyle. And I would also argue that the few that are getting the overtime, it's probably 10 times that many that are not getting the overtime, and they're not happy. They're not happy because they've been told that the overtime budget, much like on the Sean Sullivan show, you heard it, the budget's been cut, $680,000 at the jail, more than likely about the same amount over at the enforcement side in 2025, and then we see this type of overtime. So somebody's not being truthful, and I think that creates a vacuum within the rank and file. And I can assure you, where there's only just a few deputies that have benefited from the fleecing of this overtime, there are the vast majority of that department, including the jail, that was not able to work that because the access wasn't given. It wasn't fair. It wasn't distributed in a way across the board where if there is shortage of positions that need to be filled, well, who picked if it should be filled? We've seen in the Metro Jail, those were sergeants and lieutenants that were the highest paid. Surely they're not backfilling some of the lower end correctional officer positions to run a whole shift. The same would be said for a lot of the staff members with the sheriff's department. Surely they're not out there in patrol doing the legwork that the deputies are actually doing. And if they are, that's not being a good steward of the people's money because their overtime rate is so much higher than that of a deputy or even a corporal that could be available to work. And you say, well, what's the big deal? Well, there's a big deal because there's been a lot of deputies that's reached out to me and they're not happy. And I don't blame them because, you know, if the overtime is available and we do have that type of shortage, it should be fair and equitable throughout the rank and file, especially for the deputies at the bottom of the pay scale that want to make more money to provide the quality of life for their families. You know, I heard it said the other day, there's some deputies that, you know, they would like a brand new truck, but, you know, they got to make sure their wife has a nice vehicle. There's some wives, I'm sure, would like a newer vehicle with the kind of money that we've seen being spent through the sheriff's office in 25. There's a lot of families that probably would have liked to had a better, a nicer, or even take a vacation had they had the opportunity to work. So this creates a lot of animosity in the rank and file. And for you, the average everyday viewer, I don't want you to be fooled by a few deputies that's going on there making some of these allegations they're making about me. I've not disparaged anyone. I never named the deputies, but the deputies don't get to determine what's right and wrong. The elected official has to do right, one, by the people, two, what's according to the law. And unfortunately, you know, I know even some of the staff members over there, they should see the big picture. And if they don't have buy-in with that leader to ensure that the money's being spent well, they're just as complicit because otherwise they have been placed in leadership positions. And some of these are the ones that are the leaders that's coming out and making some of these snide remarks with me without really understanding the big picture. And that tells me they shouldn't even be in the position they're in. I would also say this too, without naming any of them, some of those, or at least one of those particular staff members, you know, said that there were some integrity issues with me. Absolutely not. The integrity issue is with that individual because that individual, if memory serves me correct, got into a lot of legal trouble almost at the Mobile Police Department for essentially double dipping. And what that means is that individual was working extra security jobs while being on the clock at the Mobile Police Department. And of course, there was an investigation to that, and I don't really remember the outcome. But it gets back to a couple of weeks ago when, you know, I ran the podcast about living in a glass house and yet throwing stones without realizing that, you know, when you've done things you shouldn't be doing, you're probably the least person that should be coming out and saying anything, right? And I get it. Most of them want to argue, well, you know, Prine don't know where the money come. It come from grant money. Prine don't know that this money was reimbursed. None of that has anything to do with the absorbent amount of overtime that has been given out to a select few of individuals, or it looks like a lot of the staff members or the special operations team. And so it doesn't matter where the money comes from. The issue is are we getting the most bang for our buck when we spend that kind of money? And if you need to understand what that means, if the commission gives us X amount of dollars, what are we giving back to the people in this county when we take their money? What are we giving back to them in the way of crime reduction, in the way of how that we spent their money? Did we buy 40 patrol cars last year to ensure that our men and women have the best possible equipment necessary? We should be able to tell that. Did we reduce crime in any measure? Did we solve any significant crime? Did we spend X amount of dollars on resources for major events that occurred that kind of outside of our control? Well, we simply don't know, but the truth is that's what the leader has to determine. And while there is no amount of money, well, let me just say this, that a deputy or a police officer that's working in this line of work in public safety, especially law enforcement, there's no amount, and that includes the jail, there is no amount of money you can pay an individual to do some of this work. It's tough work. It's stressful work. And I don't take away from any of that. What I'm simply saying is there is a better way to spend the people's money, and this is not that way. And so, regardless of the noise that you're hearing, you heard it here first. It is the leader's responsibility to ensure that we're doing our due diligence with the money, reducing crime, and making sure that we're doing and providing the service that we told the people we would provide to them. Now, that being said, just understand this, that I'm not opposed to anybody making any money, but typically in law enforcement, these officers and deputies work extra security jobs, to backfill and supplement their income. And that has not changed. But when we're getting angry and we're getting upset, we're not saying that you didn't miss a dinner at night. We're not saying that you didn't miss a ball game. You're singing to the choir. I did it for 30 years. I missed a lot of holidays with the kids. I missed a lot of ballpark games because I had to worry. I don't want to hear that. That's nothing more but an excuse to justify the frivolous spending with the overtime. At the end of the day, again, deputies do not get to determine at any level other than the sheriff. They do not get to determine what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And overtime is the exception to the rule. It's not the rule. And when you have multiple deputies making 70, 80, over $100,000, my friend, in overtime, I would argue that it's fleecing the taxpayer or, at best, complete incompetence when it comes to managing oversight of the people's money. My friends, you heard it here. This podcast, again, is not to be adversarial. I know one of them said, oh, well, he's mudslinging. I have not mudslinged one time, but if you notice, none of these deputies have come out and discounted if this information is true. I don't know, if it's to the penny or not. I'm not even quite sure where this website got the money. I've said that on the other program. But they've not discounted that. What they've done is tried to justify that what they did was right. And the sheriff and all these people will always tell you, because that's what every elected official do, even legislators, you can't put a price on public safety. Well, that is a true statement. But in practical terms, there is a price on public safety. And that price is doing the best, the most you can with the amount of money that you have to spend. I'm just offering that there's a better way to simply do it. My friends, thank you again for watching the program. We really would like for you to go to the YouTube page. If you caught this on Facebook, like, subscribe so you can catch the next episode. And again, this isn't mudslinging. Mudslinging is making false allegations or taking a little bit of truth and twisting it and turning it to fit a narrative. I'm just simply telling you the information I've learned as I've learned about the outfit and the operation of the Mobile County Sheriff's Department. So again, you heard it here first. We appreciate the time. We'll see you again on the next program. God bless.